Okay, welcome back to part 2 of chapter 13 on the spinal cord. So in part 1 of the video, we just got done talking through the anatomical structural divisions of the spinal cord and how sensory and motor information is traveling towards the spinal cords or away from the spinal cord and what route do they take. So once we are now out in the periphery from the spinal cord, the spinal nerves that serves the neck, upper and lower limb then branches into more complex network of nerves in which we call nerve plexus, which is formed by the anterior ramus that we were talking about, because this is talking about neck, upper and lower branches, limb branches. So that's why it is talking about coming out from the anterior ramus. Now there are 4 main nerve plexus. There's actually 5, but we're just talking about 4. The cervical plexus, brachial plexus, lumbar plexus, and sacral plexus. Okay. On your lab, I think I put thoracic plexus. That is actually not a plexus. I'll correct that when I get to the lab exercise review. But there are thoracic nerves, but we don't call it the thoracic nerve plexus, because nerve plexus are formed by these anterior rami that serve these areas. That's why we don't say thoracic plexus. It's actually thoracic nerves. Okay. But the 4 cervical plexus, for 4 plexus we'll talk about here, and also we'll mention some of these individual nerves that come out of these plexus that are more, important or something we should know from the spinal cord lab itself. We won't talk about coccygeal plexus, okay? All right, so the cervical plexus consists of the anterior rami of spinal cervical nerves. That's why it's called the cervical plexus. So it's all these cervical areas within the cervical vertebral bones. And then they innervate muscles of the neck, okay? And they also extend into the thoracic cavity. And one major nerve that comes out of the cervical plexus is called the phrenic nerve, which is meant to control the diaphragm, contractions of the diaphragm. And this will become an important muscle we talk about in the next semester when we talk about the respiratory system. What does our diaphragm do when we're doing inhalation versus exhalation, or in a sense, and there's also a difference between resting normal exhalation versus active exhalation. We'll talk about that when we get to next semester. And then you have the brachial plexus, which innervates your pectoral girdle. If you remember, we talked about pectoral girdle versus your pelvic girdle with the bone lab. And so pectoral girdle is talking about your shoulder joint, and the upper limb, which are your arms, forearms, and your hands. And they're made from contributions of your anterior rami and spinal of the spinal, cervical, and thoracic nerves. So some of it is from the cervical, some of it is from the thoracic nerves coming downwards. Okay, and the 3 specific nerves, spinal nerves, we want you to remember, or 3 specific nerve coming out of the spinal cord, is the median nerve, ulnar nerve, and the radial nerve of the brachial plexus. And it's very easy to identify these on the models or the picture. If you remember, the ulnar bone in anatomical position is closer to your pinky, then you know this nerve right here is the ulnar nerve, okay? And radius is actually closer to the thumb of your hand. So this is your radius that you can see right here, your radius bone. And hence, this right here then is your radial nerve. And then of course something in the middle here is called the median nerve. So that's why, as long as you remember which bone is closer to the pinky versus to the thumb, then you know which nerve goes where. Okay, so ulna, nerve right here, which innervate flexor muscles of the carpi ulnaris, okay? And then you have the median nerve right here, which innervates flexor muscles of your forearm. And then you have the radial nerve right here, which innervates your extensor muscles on the arm and forearm that you have identified in the muscle lab before, your extensor digitorum and palmaris longus, all that stuff. All right, so the lumbar and sacral plexus arise from lumbar and sacral segments of the spinal cord, and nerves arising at these plexuses usually innervate your pelvic girdle, which is right here, your oxcoxa bone, and your lower limbs, which then goes into your thigh muscles and your gastrocnemius, your lower leg muscles, and your feet. And so one major nerve of the lumbar plexus, we want you to know, is the femoral nerve. And just like the bone, because you have femur, and then you have also your rectus femoris muscle. So femoral nerve is what serves your thighs, okay? So it innervates quadriceps muscles, known as quadriceps femoris, skin of your anterior medial thigh, and also medial surface of your leg and foot. The other major nerve, but now is talking about from the sacral plexus, is called the sciatic nerve. And sciatic nerve is on the back of your thigh, so posterior part of your thigh. And of course, it innervates posterior of your thigh muscle. So it goes through the posterior part of your femur and goes deep into the long head of your biceps femoris. Remember, the front thigh muscle was the rectus femoris, the back thigh muscles. The first one in the back is called the biceps femoris, and then you have your semitendinosus and semimembranosus, and then going up a little bit, you have the adductor magnus, and all of those then will branch into your tibial and fibular nerves that you don't have to know. So just at least know the femoral nerve and sciatic nerve. Femoral nerve from the lumbar plexus, sciatic nerve from your sacral plexus, and then don't forget the phrenic nerve from the cervical plexus, and then the three very easy forearm nerves, medium, ulnar, and radial nerve in the brachial plexus. Okay? All right, and now on to the last topic of the chapter, which are reflexes. And again, reflexes are those rapid automatic responses to a specific stimuli that serves to preserve homeostasis a lot of times by making quick adjustment in function of the organs. Or, just removing your hand from a source of pain, in a sense, is also restoring homeostasis, because your homeostasis is interrupted by that sensation of pain, okay? Or sensation of the heat coming from a stove, for example. So a reflex arc is the route followed by nerve impulses to produce a reflex, going from a receptor to sensory neuron to interneuron to motor neuron and effector tissue. So that whole reflex arc here that you have to identify in lab within that particular model, make sure you know the 5 components of the reflex arc, which is not too hard to remember. And now let me go over with you what happens in terms of neuron impulses that we talked about in chapter 10 and 12. This kind of puts it that what we learn from both chapter into applicational perspective, because all of that we talked about in chapter 10 and 12 is related to this whole reflex arc right here. So first, we have, for example, let's say your hand accidentally lands on the thumbtack, and that particular needle now is poking into your skin, and there are specialized cells within your skin that will sense that pain sensation information, and then those will travel from the dendrites of the sensory neuron. So this is the receptor right here, and it travels inwards toward your sensory neuron. So this whole thing is your sensory neuron. Remember the cell body of the sensory neuron. So the dendrites here are taking those information, that stimulus, and then they will activate via your graded depolarization. Remember we talked about graded potentials versus action potential. Well, let me erase this right here. So those graded potentials will be what finally, if it's large enough, activate an action potential that's going to travel down the axon towards the spinal cord, okay? And once it reaches your axon terminal right here of your sensory neuron, so here's your presynaptic neuron, for example, and this is your postsynaptic neuron, and between those two is that synaptic cleft between the two neurons. So the axon terminal of this presynaptic sensory neuron here will release neurotransmitter that will activate an EPSP. Remember that? For excitation potential that will then pass the signal to your interneuron within the spinal cord, which then can travel back out in form of a motor neuron and pass that signal to a motor neuron that's going to synapse directly in an NMJ, neuromuscular junction, on the particular muscle fiber. Now, some of these interneuron can have collaterals that we talked about, and the collateral will travel, may decussate over to the other side of the spinal cord that's going to go up to the brain in form of your long ascending tracts. Remember those long versus short ascending tracts, but now we got to feel that pain coming through from that thumbtack. So that interneuron then is going to relay that sensation of pain, so we're consciously aware of the pain. If something goes wrong here and the pain doesn't go up to the brain, we're not going to feel that pain, even though the pain is there. That sensory information is coming through, but it will never reach our brain unless there's this part of the white column from your spinal cord that's going to travel via the ascending tract, long ascending tract, all the way up to your brain to feel the pain sensation, okay? And this collateral here then will then synapse on your motor neuron. Remember, motor neuron is usually a multipolar neuron, which is represented by this drawing of a multipolar neuron here, which then will the axon of your motor neuron will carry on that action potential all the way down to axon terminal at the motor end plate of your muscle fiber, okay? And then neurotransmitter like acetylcholine will be released from these axon terminals here and reach across the synaptic cleft onto the motor end plate, which is the sarcolemma of your muscle fiber, and activate an action potential on the sarcolemma, which then will activate there's that neuron transmitter release I was talking about, acetylcholine. Then that action potential will be relayed to sarcolemma, relayed to T-tubule. T-tubule activate the terminal cisternae of your sarcoplasmic reticulum to release calcium fibers, calcium ions, and goes into the sarcoplasm of that particular muscle, of all those muscle fibers. And then those calcium ion will bind to troponin. Troponin will roll away tropomyosin, which then reveals the active site on the G-actin of the actin filament, allows myosin head to bind and form a cross bridge with the active site on G-actin and have that power stroke, okay, pivot towards the M line to pull your muscle towards the M line. Sarcomeres, each individual subunit of those muscle fibers, contract all at the same time simultaneously, resulting of contraction of this particular effector muscle right here, which cause you to flex your arm, that flexion movement from about your elbow, and remove your hand from the source of pain. Now, I think that total thing took me about 10 minutes to go through, but remember, all this stuff, okay, neurotransmitter impulses, all happens within a split of a second, which is what makes me appreciate these 3 chapters that much more, because all that work we went into understanding the whole neuromuscular junction, the whole nervous system, impulse, conduction, propagation. Now we can apply it to something that we just don't even have to consciously control. It just happened automatically for you within a split of a second. That's how complicated your muscular system and your especially your nervous system is, but yet how fast it happens is just amazing. Okay? All right, so that whole thing is just wrapping up sort of what all that we learn about and applying it to in sense of a reflex. Okay, so that we are no longer, we won't keep our hand, stomped on that thumbtack forever and not able to lift that up, because if any of these part of the reflex arc doesn't happen correctly, your hand will not lift. Okay, and you're just going to keep pressing on that thumbtack, okay, until it starts bleeding like crazy. Okay. So something as simple that we don't think about really goes through a lot of things in your organ system, okay? And that's why AMP is so interesting. All right, so now there are 4 group classification of reflexes. Here comes classification again, guys. So but this is pretty easy, okay? So there are 4 ways to classify reflexes, and there's always just 2 opposite ways of classification. So now they can be first classified by development. What we mean by development is if it's a reflex that you're born with versus something that you have to learn and develop into. So if it is a reflex that you're born with, it's called an innate reflex. For example, when we are able to remove our hand away from the source of pain, all that stuff we just talked about with the thumbtack, that happens almost automatically and instantly without really thinking about it. Or blinking when someone tried to touch your eyelashes or poke their finger in your eye, you just blink as a reflex. No, those are things you don't have to learn. You're born with it. You just happen to do it naturally. Okay. Now, those reflexes that we have to learn is called acquired reflexes, okay? And these usually are more complex and they are learned motor patterns and usually enhanced only through repetitions. Then it will become a rapid and automatic reflex once we are accustomed to these acquired reflexes. For example, if you're a professional skier and your body just knows which way to sway side to side to make quick turns or speed up or stops, and in terms of that, in that sense. Or like mountain biking here, that's why I include this picture here. So, when I first started mountain biking, they say you will feel the flow of the bike and your body will move along with it, like surfing, okay? Well, when I first started mountain biking, the first time I descended from a really, really steep hill, my body did not automatically flow with the bike, okay? My rear bumped against the seat pretty hard, which radiated pain and vibration up my back, and I almost fell from being imbalanced, okay? But with more practice and doing a few mountain biking skill classes, I eventually acquired the reflex to move my body front, rear, or to the side as I'm maneuvering my bike through rocks, up hills, and down hills. Not to mention taking a lot of hard falls in the beginning while I was trying to acquire those reflexes of mountain biking. But I still remember that moment when a light bulb finally went on during a ride that I did, and I said to myself, oh, so this is what they mean for my body to flow with the bike, okay? It takes some time for you to acquire those reflexes. So, it's a good that's how you can easily remember innate versus acquired. Innate is something you're born with. Acquired is something you have to learn and develop. And these two opposite terminology will be a good thing to remember as well, because when we talk about the immune system in the next semester, there will be a difference between innate immunity versus acquired immunity. And somehow students always remember the word innate, but they forget the word acquired. Okay, so on exam, when I had fill in the blank, they will always blank out. Oh, what was that other immunity in contrast to innate? Well, here it is, okay? So it's either innate or acquired, okay? All right, innate, something you're born with. Acquired, you have to learn. All right, so the second way of classifying reflexes is through nature of motor response, which is either it's somatic or visceral. If it's a reflex, it provides a mechanism for involuntary control of your muscles. That then it's called a somatic reflex. For example, when we touch a hot stove by accident and immediately bounce back your arm in response to remove your hand away from severe burn injury, that is an example of a somatic reflex, okay? Because it has to do with moving muscles that cause you to move your hand away from the source of pain. So that, there will be, for example, that is actually more specifically speaking, an example of superficial somatic reflex, which is, a stimuli that's coming at the skin or mucous membrane. Now, there are reflexes called the stretch somatic reflex, which are those that causes sudden elongation of a tendon. For example, in the patellar knee jerk reflex, we'll talk about in a bit next. Now, if it's a reflex that control activities of smooth and cardiac muscles, then, or even our glands, then it is called a visceral or autonomic reflex. Okay, so the word autonomic already tells you this has to do with the autonomic nervous system, and we'll talk about these when we get to chapter 16 on the autonomic nervous system. Third way of classification is the complexity of the reflex circuit. So monosynaptic reflex is the simplest type of reflex arc where the sensory neuron innervates the motor neuron directly, meaning no interneuron involved. Okay, it's just a sensory neuron going synapse, forming a synapse immediately with a motor neuron back out in command. Okay. Polysynaptic reflex is where we have at least one interneuron between the sensory and motor neuron, which means there are more than one synapse. And remember, we mentioned in chapter 12, the synaptic delay comes from synapses, how many synapses you have in a certain movement or reflex. So polysynaptic reflex will result in a longer delay between the stimulus and the response depending on the number of synapses involved. And that synaptic delay, remember we talked about, is due to the influx of calcium ion into the voltage gated calcium ion channel that will cause exocytosis of your acetylcholine into the synaptic cleft. So that movement of calcium ion into the axon terminal of the neuron and the release or exocytosis of your neurotransmitter is what contributes to those synaptic delays. So that's why the more interneurons you have, the longer that reflex or movement is going to be, because it's going to take longer for those electrical signals to get through. And the last way of classification depends on the location of information processing, which was what I mentioned in the beginning of this chapter. If the important connection and processing events of neurons occur within the spinal cord, we obviously call it the spinal reflex. If it's a reflex process in the brain, we call it the cranial reflex. Pretty straightforward, okay? And then we'll wrap up this chapter by going over 4 specific examples of somatic reflexes. The most common monosynaptic reflex is called the stretch reflex, as we have mentioned just now. And the classic example of this is the patellar reflex, which results in that knee jerk when a physician taps on your knee, actually kind of below your knee a little bit. And it results in that reflex movement of your leg, extending a little bit, okay? And hence, here are the steps of the patellar reflex. The physician will tap on the patellar tendon or the patellar ligament, and then that will cause and stretch the receptors of within your quadriceps femoris muscle, because you're tapping here, stretching here, and that's going to sense that stretching sensation through your sensory neuron, okay? Sensory neuron going through your posterior root on into your posterior horn of the spinal cord. Now, Because this is a monosynaptic reflex, no interneuron exists within the spinal cord here. The sensory neuron goes straight out backwards in motor neuron, okay? So distortion of those receptors, like I was saying, is what's going to send the signal towards the spinal cord, and then out in your motor neuron, which will then control the motor units within the stretch muscles via those NMJ we talked about. And then you have that reflex contraction of your muscle that's going to cause your knee to briefly kick up a little bit, okay? That's the response of the reflex. Now, there can be different degree of abnormal responses. The normal response is supposed to be that normal knee jerk, but absence or decrease in this reflex is known as a Westphal sign, and that may indicate damage to the central nervous system, particularly your spinal cord or your lower motor neurons. Because it can be something wrong going here or something wrong going here, okay? Depends. So that's why it can be either or, that which leads you to not have this response. Now, multiple oscillation of the leg is not a good sign either. It can be an indication of cerebellar diseases, and then an exaggerated reflex, like kicking someone in the face when you tap on their knee, that can indicate hyperthyroidism, anxiety, or nervousness as well, okay? Some are physiological, some are psychological, okay? All right, and another common stretch reflex example we'll talk about here is the Achilles reflex, which is, and it's kind of unfortunate that we don't get to do these reflexes in person this semester because we're going online, but a good number of my students usually have a lot of fun doing these reflexes when we are in lab. So the stimulus of Achilles reflex is when the physician taps on the Achilles or calcaneal tendon we learned about in the muscle lab. When the foot, when that calcaneal tendon is tapped, it's going to stimulate your foot to do a bit of dorsiflexion, okay, go up and jerking a little bit, and support that, when the physician, of course, is supporting the ball of your feet in the front, okay, anterior end. Or usually instead of holding someone's feet, we ask students to, one of the tested student to lay on the lab table, and then face down, and then I can tap on their calcaneal tendon while they're with their feet hanging the side of the lab table. And the response should be that foot will jerk towards the planar surface, or, we can go this way or that way, okay? Now, this reflex usually checks your S1 and S2 nerve roots of the spinal cord, which then relays a signal to your sciatic nerve that we talked about within your sacral plexus. Delay reflex of Achilles can indicate hypothyroidism. Reduction of this reflex can be indicative of peripheral neuropathy, or absent could actually mean disc herniation that completely shuts off that sensory information coming through, or motor information coming out of the spinal cord. All right, now this specific example of somatic reflex is called a withdrawal reflex, which is a more complex reflex involving more synapses. So far here we were talking about sensory neuron going straight into a motor neuron. So both knee jerk reflex, patellar reflex, and Achilles reflex are examples of monosynaptic reflex. Now, withdrawal reflex is more complex and involve more synapses. So this is an example of a polysynaptic reflex. We call it the withdrawal reflex because it's a coordinated movement that allow the individual to move away from the source of the stimulus by activating and inhibiting muscle groups simultaneously. This is what I was talking about in terms of antagonist muscles, okay? So this specific example is called the flexor reflex, usually affecting muscles of a limb. Now, for example, when you grab an unexpectedly hot pan here on the stove, pain receptors on your skin will be stimulated. Sensory neuron will be carrying that sensory information towards your spinal cord via your posterior root into your posterior horn of the spinal cord. Now it involves an existence of an interneuron. An interneuron can actually split in 3 collaterals, you can see here, okay? One collateral synapses with a motor neuron that causes your flexor muscles to do an action, whereas the other collateral synapses with another neuron that causes your extensor muscles to be inhibited, okay? So in order for you to do this hand jerk movement, you have to stimulate your flexor muscles and at the same time inhibit your extensor muscle, which is what we were talking about in terms of dopamine. When we're saying dopamine can have an inhibitory effect of the basal nuclei, which basal nuclei is supposed to activate your muscles, and then dopamine can then do the opposite of inhibiting to produce a smooth action. Okay, so this is what we were talking about here. Okay, and now this third collateral coming off of the interneuron going up to the brain can then be that pain sensations we're talking about that can go up to the brain, so that your brain feels the pain. But usually, if you think about it, that pain is almost instantaneously the same time you jerk your hand away from the pan. You won't be like, okay, jerk my hand away and then I feel the pain, or I feel pain first and then I jerk my hand away. It's almost very quickly in that instantaneous second. It's because your interneuron is relaying those signals to multiple things at the same time. But still, that split second is still not as fast as your patellar reflex or your calcaneal tendon reflex, okay, because it involves that polysynaptic route. And the last specific example of somatic reflex is the most complicated one out of the 4. It's called the cross extensor reflex. Sorry for that. My thing kind of moved down. Okay. So cross-extensor reflex, which can be classified as contralateral or what we call consensual reflex within the lab, like when we did pupillary, we talked about the pupillary reflex in the human reflex physiology lab. Consensual, or another word for it, contralateral, means that when one side of the body is stimulated, the other side of the body also gets affected. So it's a motor response to a stimulus that also occurs on the side opposite the stimulus. And what we mean by that is, for example, let's say you're standing upright and then you accidentally stepped on a thumbtack, okay? I guess this textbook just loves examples of stepping on thumbtacks and touching thumbtacks. But now you have interneurons responding. So of course you have the sensory neuron delivering that pain information going through your ventral root, okay, or posterior root into the posterior horn. Now you see this interneuron doing a couple of things, okay? It now forms, again, four collaterals, one going towards this motor neuron, one going towards this motor neuron, one going towards this other one for inhibition. So EPSP is being sent to these 2 black motor neurons here. IPSP is being sent to these blue motor neurons here. And then at the same time, you have these collaterals going up to the brain. Okay, so what happens you're seeing is you have sensory information, sensation that has decussation or decussed over to the other side of your spinal cord to tell your other leg what to do. When you step on the thumbtack and you feel that pain, of course, this leg is going to move away from the source of pain. So your flexor muscles are stimulated. Extensor muscles are inhibited for this particular leg that is stimulated. So that's that side that is stimulated. Now, the opposite leg, which is the consensual side of this reflex, has to maintain balance because now you're picking up this leg will have to stand upright to maintain balance. So the opposite leg's extensor muscles has to be stimulated while the flexor muscles are inhibited. And that way, this leg extends, able to support your shifting weight as you're lifting that foot up. If this somehow didn't occur right, the moment you lift your foot up, then probably you're going to fall because then you don't have extensor muscles and that's going to keep you balanced on your other leg. Okay, so it is important that all these synapses are all going on at the same time for you to do something that we normally do so quickly. Okay, so that's what the cross extensor reflex is about. Okay, so all four of these things going on at the same time. Okay. All right, so like I said, it's not a long chapter and we're already done. That's all I have for you for chapter 13 on spinal cord. Let's go over the practice question and we will be done. What is the minimal number of neurons in a reflex arc? 2, which is your monosynaptic reflex, the simplest type of reflex arc, your sensory neuron, and then your motor neuron. Which of these is not an important factor concerning reflexes? They involve interaction with olfactory lobe. We haven't even talked about the olfactory lobe at all or the olfactory nerve at all. So that's why that is not related to reflexes. Ascending tracts relay information from the periphery to sensory cortex because a sensory tract, remember, go up to the brain. So it must be sensory information coming from your peripheral part of your body. You just touched a hot stove. What type of reflex did you experience? In what way was your brain involved in the reflex? Well, it was a spinal reflex because it just goes through your spine, okay? You touch a hot stove, you move, you withdraw your hand. The brain was not involved in the reflex per se though, okay? The interneuron goes through the spinal cord. What went up to our brain is sensation of pain. But remember, the pain doesn't have to be felt in order for the reflex to happen. If somehow it is particularly just the ascending tract or something that goes up that send that pain information to our brain is damaged, while the motor neuron that is connecting with the interneuron still works, the reflex still happens, but you may not feel that pain. So technically speaking, for the reflex to happen, the brain was not involved. And during a withdrawal reflex, the limb on the side opposite the stimulus is what? And this response is called so the limb on the opposite side of stimulus extends, and this response is called a cross extensor reflex. The example of stepping on the thumbtack, and we have to make sure we activate the other leg as well to maintain balance. These neurons interpret information and coordinate responses, interneurons. Gray matter of the spinal cord contains your neural cell bodies and unmyelinated axons. I think I said that like 5 times now throughout the semester. A person with polio has lost the use of his leg muscles. In which area of his spinal cord would you expect the virus-infected motor neurons to be? Motor neurons, and it is his leg muscles. So leg, which is a limb, okay, limb, and then motor, so anterior gray horns, okay, because we're talking about, we're not even talking about ramus here, so not necessarily the limb information, but we're talking about somehow it affected his motor neurons. So remember the butterfly shaped thing, okay? So the back posterior horn here is for sensory information to come through. The anterior horn here is for your motor information to go outwards. Okay, sensory information comes in through the posterior horn, and then motor commands goes out from your anterior horn. So if he cannot do motor, it affected his motor neuron, then it is his anterior gray horn that is affected. Which portion of the spinal cord will be affected by a disease, a damaged myelin sheath? your columns, because myelin sheath is affecting myelinated nerve axons. Okay, myelinated axon. So, and myelinated axon is dealing with your white columns of the spinal cord. Your gray matter is that butterfly-shaped part of the spinal cord. Now, injury to the what plexus will interfere with the ability to breathe. The what nerve is a major nerve of this plexus. You have cervical plexus and the phrenic nerve that serves your diaphragm. When a person always leans his or her head on a hand to stay awake in class, for example, putting your elbow on your desk and leaning on your hand, this can put pressure on the elbow and damage which particular nerve. Remember your elbow here? This is formed by the olecranon of your ulnar bone, so hence you could damage your ulnar nerve. And that's why when we lean on our elbow on the desk a lot, after a while, you start feeling that numbness coming through. Is because you're compressing on that particular ulnar nerve. Compression of which nerve bothers older people in long car rides. Now, and remember, car rides, you're sitting down, okay, so there's your leg sitting down on the chair. So which nerve are you compressing? Are you compressing this nerve or this nerve back here? When you sit on a chair, okay, you're compressing this nerve back here. So the nerve back there on the back of your thigh, sciatic nerve, okay? An anesthetic blocks function of the dorsi or dorsal or your back posterior rami of cervical spinal nerve. Which area of the body is affected? So we're talking about your posterior rami, so your skin and muscles of the neck and skin and muscles of the shoulders as well. Okay, and that's all I have for chapter 13. I will see you again in the next chapter.